I never know quite what I'm going to say till I've said it. So I'm listening with interest to this. Anyway, if you're listening on Facebook or YouTube or radio, I do pray that God will speak to you today. Now, before I share the text, because I'm going to ask you, because I normally have a title, and I'm going to ask you what you think the title might be. But before that, I'm going to share you a little of my own testimony that illustrates this text, perhaps. In 1969, I went for the very first time to the Keswick Convention, which some of you may have heard of. And at the end of the week, they have a special meeting on the Friday in which people are invited to commit their lives to serve the Lord in full-time service. And young as I was, I found that I was compelled to stand up on that day. Things were very different for me as a result of doing that. Because when I got home, I sensed, because I only knew one thing at that time, my father was a very godly Anglican clergyman who loved the Bible. And I knew many of his friends, and I never knew anything about free churches in those days. I only knew the Anglican Church. And I felt God was calling me to go into the Church of England, to become a rector or vicar or whatever. And there's lots of requirements. I'd had a very mixed education and had left school, believe it or not, without anything. I've now got an alphabet after my name, but that's God's fault. Anyway, in order to meet entry requirements, I needed to get A-levels. So I gave up the job that I had. I was living in Leicester at the time, and I went to study A-levels to get the basic requirements. You might know that the procedure in the Anglican Church is very complex. Interviews and committees, and finally you go for a residential 3 days to Ackham, where you're examined and questioned. Well, everybody I knew said, "John, we know God's on your life, and we can see that this is the right thing to do." But do you know what? The results of the selection was, "You're not suitable." Do you know, I was so broken-hearted. I'd given up my job. I'd even given up the girl that I was going out with at the time, because God had to come first. I just could not understand it. I don't know, have you ever felt you were called to something and it completely go wrong? You see, my understanding at the time was very limited. I only saw it then. But looking back, this is some years ago, I now know that it was God stopped it. Because I'm so pleased and delighted that God called me into the Congregational Church. Because things have changed dramatically. And God is behind everything in life. Now, have any of you got an idea what might be the title of the sermon today? Well, It's Genesis chapter 42 and verse 36. All these things are against me. Huh? Have any of you ever felt that? I guess there's a lot of people in Ukraine at the moment thinking that, aren't there? And in Afghanistan and throughout the world, all these things are against me. That story actually comes from the 42nd chapter of Genesis. Some of you may know it better than others. And when you have a moment, you might like to refresh your memory by reading through that chapter. But Jacob had passed through many dark experiences in the course of his long and intricate career. But perhaps this hour to which God had now led him was what the poet calls the sorrow's crown of sorrow. Joseph was lost, he thought. Simeon, he was never to see again. And now Benjamin, the light of his eyes in his old age, was being grasped by mysterious hands. It is small wonder that the old man's heart was nearly broken. Joseph is not, Simeon is not, and will you take Benjamin away? All these things, says the patriarch, are against me. It is on those words, then, that I wish to dwell for a little today. And there are 3 points I want us to consider. First, there are times when everything seems to be against us. I can see some nodding heads. Second, the things that seem against us may not be really so. And thirdly, regardless whether they are not or they are, we can still triumph. I like that. Christians should be victorious, not defeated. Well, first then, there are times when everything seems to be against us. It's clear that such a time had come to Jacob. He reached an hour such as we all reach sometimes, when in the whole sky there was not one glimmer of sunshine. It had been a desolate season. I doubt not long ago when Jacob left his home and took the road to Bethel. But he was a young man then, with a heart that was beating bravely, and his life holding many exciting prospects. Now he was old. Life's fire was damped, and the land was famine-stricken, and his sons were lost. Jacob had reached one of those bitter times when everything seemed to be against him. Perhaps you can recall another scene which we find in the book of Job, a scene that forever, to the discerning heart, is exquisitely and dramatically true. A messenger to Job, and before he had finished speaking, another arrived. And further, one turned up bringing bad news. The bad news was that these messengers brought had the same effect of a tropical storm that can suddenly rise out of nowhere and destroy years of hard work. Job, in a single day, was left a ruined and desolate man, just like people in the Ukraine having their houses destroyed and relatives murdered. It's hard for us to understand how God can allow circumstances like this to happen. But we may thank God that the Bible was not written by professors, but by men who knew the realities of life. It's not the way of the messengers of evil to come at respectable and ordered distance. Sometimes the hand of one has barely ceased to knock when the feet of another are hurrying to the threshold. So out of our own experience, do we understand what the rapid succession of the patriarch's servant means? Like Jacob, Job had reached one of those sunless hours when everything seemed to be against him. If this view of the coming trouble be a true one, and not a rare or exceptional experience, there is one proof of it that we shall be sure to find. We shall find it expressed in Proverbs. For a proverb is an epitome of life, and a proverb will only survive if it contains an element of truth. Well then, have we not one proverb that says, troubles never come singly? Huh? Have we experienced that? I question if there's any literature in the world that does not have proverbs which contain a similar thought. These proverbs have survived because we feel that they ring true. These proverbs are powerful because they are pictorial and express something which we all recognize. They might be written across this hour in Jacob's life, and they might form the motto of ours in your life and mine. For if every man finds that he had his good days, in which life moves forward like a strain of music, in which work prospers and time is well redeemed, and every friend with whom he meets is friendly, so every man, I take it, has his bad days, and his whole world seems to have gone amiss, when work seems useless, when every voice is jarring, and when vexation follows hard upon vexation. It's not a new experience. Jacob knew it well. And so did Job in that memorable hour. If you have times when everything goes against you, remember that the saints and heroes of the past have been familiar with the same experience. We can find traces of unequal pressure in the life of Jesus. No one can study the gospel with an unbiased mind without detecting that experience there. I've heard men describe the human life of Christ as if it were one long and overwhelming heartache. I've heard others describe it as full of gladness, that he must have felt like singing all the time. But if we only lay aside our bigotry and, like honest men and women, study the gospel page, we shall find that the actual facts are very different. The sunshine and the shadow in the life of Jesus were unequally and irregular distributed. There were days for him when every voice made music. There were hours when everything seemed to be against him. Had it been otherwise, the Bible dared not have been written that he was tempted in all points like as we are. In the famous story of chivalry in Switzerland, you may remember Arnold von Winkelried met his death in the Battle of Sempach in 1386. He gathered the spears of the Austrians together and, pierced by 20 points, died for his country. So to our Lord there came the hour of darkness when sorrows were massed and gathered as to a common centre. He died as a sacrifice upon the cross. Will you remember that when the worst comes to the worst? It is no strange trial that has befallen you. You are not exceptional in having days of gladness followed by hours when everything is dark. Jacob and Job had that, and David and Jesus of Nazareth, times when everything seemed to be against them. And it's a great thing to keep good company. But I pass on now in the second place. Things that seem against us may not really be so. If we stop for a moment, we might realize that Jacob's interpretation of events might not be correct. Joseph is not, and Simeon is not, and will you take Benjamin away? He thought, didn't he, that Joseph was dead, slain out at Dothan, and Joseph was prime minister of Egypt. He thought that Simeon was in the hands of his enemies, and the most powerful statesman in Egypt was his friend. He thought that Benjamin would be seized and slain in Egypt, and over Benjamin's brother's love was yearning. Things never seemed blacker with Jacob than just then. As a matter of fact, things had never been brighter. Do you hear that? Things were never brighter. We may look at the situation in Ukraine, but God's behind that. He's changing. The day is coming, and it's not long before he's back here in all of his glory. Like a phoenix, Ukraine will rise again. It's not the end. God is sorting things out amongst the nations. Yes, he cried, all this is against me. And he thought it was. But then, if ever his life, the flowing tide was with him, we say, don't we, the darkest hour is before the dawn. But this was more than that. It was the dawn itself. But Jacob was blinded, heavy with overmuch sorrow. His mind was closed by negative thoughts. He said to his sons, beloved, it is night. When ought He should have said, "Beloved, it is morn." We can see the same thing happening in the New Testament when we read what happened to the Apostle Paul. We find an hour in the life of that great heart when he cried, "All these things are against me, a child of freedom, yet imprisoned in Rome, the wide world calling him, and the gospel of Christ to preach, yet held in a close ward and unable to leave the barracks." Were not these things, that chain, that duress, were not all these things against the great apostle? Like Jacob in his tent so long before, what seemed against him was not really so. All Christendom is God's debtor for that chain. The chain of Paul has helped us to our liberty. There is a depth and a compassion in his prison letters that nothing but seclusion could have given him. A few weeks ago here at the chapel, we sang all the hymns of William Cowper, a man who suffered melancholy all his life. Oh, what depth those hymns were, how they moved our hearts of those of us who were here. And if Paul's great aim was to tell the world of Christ and to spread abroad through the nations the gospel of forgiveness, we know now that all his many wanderings, serviceable and blessed though they were, have not done so much for the nations and the ages as have the days when he was a prisoner in Rome. As with Jacob and with Paul, so I think it is with every one of us. God wraps his blessings up in strange disguises, and we rarely have faith to see into their heart. Many a thing that we should call a curse in the language of heaven may be called a blessing, and many a thing we welcome as a blessing in the language of heaven may be called a curse. I have known a piece of good fortune come to men, and it just sapped their character and ruined their children. How many have been blessed when they've won the lottery? There's a trail of disaster of those millionaires. The easy life is the hardest of all lives to live without rotting of the moral fibre. But I've known lives too that suddenly were burdened, and the burden at the first seemed intolerable, yet the will has been so strengthened and the heart so nerved in the very bearing of the unlooked for load. It has so widened the responsiveness, enlarged the outlook, and deepened and sweetened all the springs of character, that by the end of the day, the burden is transfigured into the love gift of Almighty God. How often does a mother say to her child, "Child, child, you don't know what is good for you"? Perhaps in this matter, even the wisest of us are only children of a larger growth. And so, like Jacob, we cry, "All this is against us. It is ruining our happiness. It is spoiling our lives. And God, in his infinite wisdom, lets the thorn remain and whispers, my strength is made perfect in your weakness. There is an old and beautiful legend. You know, I'm known for telling stories. Well, here's another one. That St. Christopher, that comes down to us from the medieval church. St. Christopher was a man of great prowess and was a ferryman and lived on the bank of a broad and swift-flowing river. And one winter's night, when he was an old and white-haired man, he heard a voice calling him from across the river, and wading over where he found a little child who asked the ferryman to carry him across. St. Christopher did it, for he loved his Lord. Putting the little child on his back, he plunged into the stream. But the weight of the child grew heavier and heavier as he advanced, until in midstream, where the torrent swirled and swept, the burden became well nigh insupportable. And the old ferryman breathed a prayer to God that he might not fail in his duty to the stranger. He struggled on until the bank was reached, and he stopped to let the burden down. And then, in the twinkling, the night shone as day, and he saw that the traveller he had borne was Christ. Out in midstream he cried, "This is against me." But on the bank he cried, "It is the Lord." And it may be that on resurrection morning others will cry that besides. St. Christopher, nothing is against us that draws us nearer to God. I'm going to repeat that, underline it. Nothing is against us that draws us nearer to God. And how often is that troubles and heartache and difficulties? God put us here just that we might be his. I would suggest then, in all of life's darker seasons, it would be wise and reverent to suspend our judgment. It takes the totality to understand the parts, and we shall not see the whole until the morning. The things that seem against us then may not be really so. And lastly, whether they are or whether they're not, we may still triumph. That's what I want. Anyone here want to triumph? How many of us have said it's all against me? How many of us have got it all wrong? But now, this is the key, isn't it? Victory! At the beginning of the last century in Britain, there were two poets whom everyone was reading. One of these two poets was Lord Byron, and the other was Sir Walter Scott. You do know them, haven't you? Both of these poets, strangely enough, were lame. Both of them knew that their lameness was against them. Yet in all history, literary history, there is nothing more notable than the different ways in which they grappled with the trial. Byron was embittered by his lameness. He brooded on it till he loathed it. He thought of it The thought of it took much of the colour and the beauty out of a character that might have been fair. But Sir Walter Scott, even to his dearest friend, never complained or spoke one bitter word about it until at last, "Ah, Scott," said Byron, "I would give all my fame to have your happiness. If God be for us, who can be against us?" This is a bit we forget. All things are working together for our good. So may a man whose faith is firm and steadfast wrestle on towards heaven, against storm and wind and tide, to the light affliction which endureth for a moment is changed in the glory of the dawn. Is there anybody here wants to be a Sir Walter Scott? Let's glory. Let it use us. Let's be victorious. Well, we're going to sing our final hymn today, which is a wonderful one, because we've got a lot to proclaim. It's one of the best hymns in the whole book. 631. Tell out, my soul, the greatness of the Lord. 631.